In the early hours of August 7, 1942, the war in the Pacific crossed an invisible line. Until that moment, the United States had been reacting, absorbing blows, retreating, rebuilding, learning how to fight an enemy that had dominated the seas for decades. Guadalcanal changed that. Operation Watchtower was not just another landing. It was a gamble born of urgency, fear, and incomplete preparation, a calculated risk taken before the balance of power was truly ready to shift. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American forces would strike first. The target seemed modest on the map, a jungle-covered island in the southern Solomons, barely developed, barely known to the wider world. But Guadalcanal held something far more dangerous than its size suggested. Japanese engineers were carving an airfield out of the coral and mud near Lunga Point, an unfinished strip that, once operational, would threaten the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. If Japan completed that airfield, it could strangle Allied logistics across the South Pacific. That airfield would later be named Henderson Field. On August 7th, it was little more than scraped earth and scattered construction equipment. Yet it was enough to trigger the first American offensive of the Pacific War. At dawn, under low clouds and uncertain intelligence, U.S. Marines went ashore. The landings themselves were deceptively smooth. Unlike later assaults in the Pacific, there was no immediate wall of fire, no massed Japanese defense waiting at the beaches. The Imperial Japanese Army garrison on Guadalcanal was small and unprepared for a full-scale invasion. By nightfall, Henderson Field was in American hands, captured almost intact. Bulldozers, fuel drums, and aviation supplies fell into Marine possession. On land, it looked like a clean victory. At sea, the situation was far more fragile. The American invasion fleet, transport ships packed with men, ammunition, fuel, and food, lay exposed in the narrow waters surrounding Guadalcanal and nearby islands. Air cover was limited. Coordination between Navy and Marines was rushed. Many ships had already begun unloading when alarms of approaching Japanese forces filtered through fragmented radio reports. The landing force depended entirely on naval protection, and that protection was thin, improvised, and inexperienced. Japanese commanders reacted with speed and clarity. From Rabole and truck, alarm bells rang through the Imperial Navy. Guadalcanal was not just an island, it was a threat to Japan's entire defensive perimeter. The response was immediate: destroy the American beachhead at all costs. Every available cruiser, destroyer, and aircraft was ordered south. The objective was simple and brutal: annihilate the invasion fleet, cut the Marines off from supply, and let hunger, disease, and isolation finish the job on land. What followed was not a single battle, but a prolonged naval slaughter. The Japanese understood something the Americans were about to learn the hard way: Guadalcanal was a naval battlefield first and a land battle second. Whoever controlled the surrounding waters would decide the fate of the island. Night after night, steel would clash in confined seas. Radar would be tested against experience. Courage would collide with doctrine. And the ocean itself would become a graveyard. On August 7th, none of that was yet visible from the beaches. Marines dug in around Henderson Field, unaware that the calm of the landing was already ending. Offshore, American ships stood at anchor, silhouetted against tropical horizons, vulnerable and unaware that Japanese warships were already moving toward them under cover of darkness. Operation Watchtower had begun, but the threshold of fire had only just been crossed. The night of August 8 to 9, 1942, fell heavy and black over the waters north of Guadalcanal. For the American fleet guarding the invasion transports, darkness was supposed to bring safety. Doctrine said the Japanese avoided night action. Experience said the threat would come at dawn, from the air. Both assumptions were catastrophically wrong. While Allied ships maintained loose patrols around Savo Island, a Japanese striking force was already cutting through the darkness like a blade. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa did not hesitate. Upon learning of the American landings, he gathered every cruiser and destroyer he could assemble at Rabole and sailed south at full speed. His force, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, threaded the narrow channels of the Solomon Islands in silence. Lookouts were sharp. Crews were veterans. Their weapons, especially the Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, were the most lethal afloat. They were trained for this kind of night. The Allied screen around Guadalcanal was fragmented and poorly coordinated. Radar was primitive and not fully trusted. Command arrangements were confused, and many crews were exhausted after days of tension covering the landings. Some ships were at condition 2, not fully battle-ready. Others assumed any approaching vessels would be friendly. Shortly after 1:30 a.m., Mikawa struck. Japanese cruisers slipped undetected past Allied destroyer pickets and split into attack groups, moving at high speed through the narrow waters off Savo Island. Flares suddenly burst overhead, silhouetting Allied ships in ghostly white light. Seconds later, torpedoes were already in the water. What followed was annihilation. The Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Canberra was hit almost immediately, multiple shells and torpedoes tearing into her hull before she could even fire a shot. Power failed. Fires raged. Within minutes, she was a burning wreck, drifting helplessly. Across the formation, the American heavy cruisers USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and USS Astoria were caught equally unprepared. Searchlights snapped on. Guns fired blindly. Orders overlapped. Shells tore through bridges and engine rooms. Japanese gunners fired with precision. Their shells punched into magazines, command spaces, and machinery. Torpedoes struck home with devastating effect. Quincy was hit repeatedly at point-blank range, her bridge obliterated, her decks awash in fire. Vincennes attempted to maneuver, but it was already too late. Astoria fought briefly, scoring hits, but she too was mortally wounded. In less than an hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sinking or doomed. The sea was littered with burning oil, wreckage, and men struggling in the water. Japanese ships maneuvered effortlessly among the chaos, firing, reloading, and withdrawing before a coherent defense could form. It was a masterclass in night combat, and a brutal exposure of Allied inexperience. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the attack ended. Admiral Mikawa made a controversial decision. Instead of pressing on to destroy the vulnerable American transports at Guadalcanal, ships that held the lifeline of the Marine landing force, he turned north and withdrew. Concerned about daylight air attack from American carriers, he chose survival over total destruction. That single choice changed the campaign. The cost of Savo Island was staggering. Over 1,000 Allied sailors were dead. 4 heavy cruisers lay on the bottom. It was the worst defeat the U.S. Navy had suffered in a single action. Survivors would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, the sudden flares, the impossible accuracy of Japanese fire, the sense that the night itself had betrayed them. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the implications were terrifying. They woke to the news that their naval shield had been shattered. The transports soon departed, leaving supplies unloaded, ammunition limited, and no guarantee of reinforcement. Henderson Field was in American hands, but the sea around it belonged to no one. Savo Island taught a merciless lesson. In these waters, darkness favored the prepared, not the confident. And the war for Guadalcanal was only beginning. After the disaster at Savo Island, one reality became undeniable. Guadalcanal could not be held without control of the air. Both sides understood this with absolute clarity. The campaign was about to shift from surface ambushes and night torpedo attacks to a decisive test of carrier-based air power. In August 1942, Japan committed its most valuable remaining assets. The fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, moved south with a clear objective: destroy the American carriers, cover the arrival of reinforcements, and neutralize the threat posed by Henderson Field. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was a chance to regain the initiative with a single, crushing blow. The U.S. Navy was prepared to meet them. USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga operated east of Guadalcanal, guarding supply convoys and the fragile beachhead. American commanders understood that losing their carriers would likely doom the entire Watchtower operation. Unlike Japan, however, the United States was no longer relying solely on pilot skill and daring. Radar detection, coordinated fighter direction, and layered anti-aircraft defense were becoming central to American naval doctrine. On the 24th of August, 1942, the battle unfolded beyond visual range. Both sides launched strike groups without knowing exactly where the enemy carriers were. It was a battle of search aircraft, intercepted radio signals, and timing. Planes vanished over the horizon while carrier crews waited in tense silence, unsure whether the next aircraft to appear would be returning pilots or incoming attackers. The first major blow fell on USS Enterprise. Japanese dive bombers broke through fighter cover and intense anti-aircraft fire. Bombs struck the flight deck, igniting fires, killing crewmen, and knocking aircraft aside like debris. Explosions rippled through the ship as damage control teams fought flames amid fuel fires and live ammunition. Enterprise survived, and remained operational. American aircraft soon struck back. Shokaku was hit repeatedly, her flight deck torn open, aircraft destroyed, and flight operations brought to a halt. Zuikaku escaped direct damage but lost a significant portion of her experienced aircrews during the engagement. Here, the deeper imbalance revealed itself. Japan could still build carriers, but it could not replace trained naval aviators at the required pace. Every lost pilot weakened the fleet permanently. The United States, by contrast, was fighting a systemic war where carriers, radar, fighter direction, industrial output, and training pipelines formed a single, expanding machine. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons ended without a sunken carrier. Tactically, it appeared inconclusive. Strategically, it was not. Japanese reinforcement convoys failed to reach Guadalcanal in strength. The Imperial Navy withdrew. Henderson Field remained in American hands. Most critically, Japan lost another irreplaceable portion of its elite carrier air arm. This battle marked a turning point. Surface victories and night torpedo attacks were no longer enough if daylight skies belonged to the enemy. From this moment forward, the struggle for Guadalcanal, and the Pacific itself, would be decided not by who ruled the darkness, but by who controlled the air above the sea. After the shock of Savo Island, the U.S. Navy faced an uncomfortable truth: its surface forces were dangerously unprepared for night combat. Japanese ships had demonstrated superior training, coordination, and deadly effectiveness in darkness. Guadalcanal, however, left no room for retreat. The Americans had to adapt, or be destroyed night after night. Cape Esperance became the testing ground. In October 1942, Japanese forces prepared another high-speed reinforcement run, the feared Tokyo Express. Fast cruisers and destroyers were tasked with delivering troops and heavy equipment to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, followed by a bombardment intended to neutralize Henderson Field. If successful, Japanese air power could finally return in force. This time, the Americans were waiting. Rear Admiral Norman Scott positioned a mixed force of cruisers and destroyers north of Guadalcanal, armed with one crucial advantage that had been absent at Savo Island: radar used proactively for interception, not merely navigation. For the first time in the campaign, American commanders intended to fight the Japanese on their own terms, at night. Shortly after midnight on the 11th of October, 1942, radar contacts appeared. In the darkness west of Savo Island, two naval formations unknowingly crossed paths. Visibility was near zero. Orders were confused. Identification was uncertain. But unlike previous encounters, American ships knew the enemy was there, and roughly where. When gunfire erupted, it was sudden and violent. American cruisers Helena, Salt Lake City, Boise, and San Francisco opened fire at close range. Japanese cruiser Furutaka was hit repeatedly, her bridge shattered, fires spreading uncontrollably. Destroyer Fubuki was obliterated in minutes. Shells tore through steel at point-blank distances, lighting the sea with muzzle flashes and burning wreckage. The Japanese were stunned, but not helpless. Counterfire slammed into USS Boise, detonating ammunition and nearly breaking the ship in half. Fires raged below decks as damage control teams fought to prevent catastrophic explosions. For long minutes, the outcome remained uncertain, balanced between chaos and collapse. Eventually, Japanese forces withdrew. Furutaka sank later that night. Reinforcements failed to reach Guadalcanal in strength. Henderson Field survived another attempt at neutralization. Tactically, Cape Esperance was a modest American victory. Strategically, it was far more important. For the first time in the Guadalcanal campaign, the U.S. Navy proved it could detect, engage, and defeat Japanese surface forces in darkness. Radar-guided gunfire had broken the myth of Japanese night invincibility, even if imperfectly, even at high cost. Yet the lesson was incomplete. Coordination problems, friendly fire risks, and command confusion still plagued American night actions. Cape Esperance was not the end of Japan's dominance in the dark, but it was the beginning of its erosion. The echoes of gunfire off Cape Esperance signaled a quiet shift. The night was no longer Japan's uncontested domain. And in the brutal waters around Guadalcanal, even small advantages would decide who survived until dawn. The night of October 13, 1942, would later earn its grim nickname among the Marines and sailors who survived it, the Barroom Brawl. Chaos, confusion, and courage collided in a confined, darkened ocean where ships fought in near point-blank range, and the rules of conventional naval combat seemed to vanish entirely. American forces had learned from Cape Esperance, but the Japanese were relentless. The Imperial Navy dispatched a powerful task force to reinforce Guadalcanal and strike at Henderson Field. This time, the Japanese intended to crush the beachhead once and for all. Among their assets were battleships, cruisers, and a screen of destroyers skilled in night combat and armed with deadly long-lance torpedoes, capable of wiping out ships at distances Americans had yet to fully appreciate. The engagement began in darkness. Visibility was almost non-existent, and radar technology was still primitive. Ships maneuvered with extreme caution, yet collisions, misidentifications, and crossfire quickly turned the sea into a confused battlefield. Sailors later described it as if the ocean itself had become a spinning, burning maze of steel and fire. Amid the chaos, USS Helena, USS Juno, USS Atlanta, and USS San Francisco were engaged in desperate maneuvers against the Japanese cruisers and destroyers. Explosions rocked the American ships as torpedoes found their marks. The Juno, tragically, was struck by multiple torpedoes, leading to the death of over 600 sailors, including the famous Sullivan brothers, whose story would later become a symbol of sacrifice. The battle was fought at close quarters. Guns roared within a few hundred yards, shells tore through decks, and ships maneuvered frantically to avoid catastrophic hits. Smoke, fire, and confusion made identification nearly impossible. American destroyers made bold torpedo runs against the Japanese battleships, a desperate effort to stem the tide. Their audacity disrupted Japanese plans and bought precious time for Henderson Field to remain operational. By dawn, the battle had ended, leaving a grim tally, several ships sunk or badly damaged, hundreds of casualties, and the realization that control of the waters around Guadalcanal remained fiercely contested. Yet for all its horror, the night demonstrated that the Americans were learning quickly. Their crews adapted, their tactics improved, and their willingness to fight in such overwhelming circumstances began to shape the emerging balance of power. The night of Friday the 13th was more than a battle, it was a lesson in survival, improvisation, and sheer courage. The Marines on Guadalcanal continued to hold the island, but the price paid in blood and steel underscored the brutal reality of naval warfare in the Solomons. Victory was measured not in glory, but in who remained afloat when the sun rose. The morning of November 15, 1942, brought one of the most dramatic and decisive confrontations of the Guadalcanal campaign, a duel between two battleships in the confined, treacherous waters off the Solomon Islands. For the first time in the Pacific War, American radar technology would demonstrate its full potential, and the balance of night combat began to shift decisively. The Japanese Kirishima, a heavily armored Congo-class battleship, had been ordered to shell Henderson Field and crush the beleaguered American forces on Guadalcanal. Its mission was clear: support the Imperial Navy's efforts to secure the island and restore Japanese dominance in the Solomons. American commanders, aware of this threat, moved swiftly to intercept. USS Washington, a modern battleship equipped with advanced radar-directed fire control, was deployed along with accompanying cruisers and destroyers. Unlike earlier night engagements, American gunners could now detect and accurately target enemy ships despite near-total darkness. This technological advantage, combined with disciplined crew training, gave Washington a chance to confront Kirishima on nearly equal footing. The battle commenced under the cover of night. At first, both ships maneuvered cautiously, exchanging preliminary salvos. Kirishima's heavy guns roared, sending shells whistling through the blackness, but many fell short or passed harmlessly overhead. Washington, guided by radar, held fire until the optimal range was reached. Then the American gunners unleashed a concentrated barrage. The results were devastating. Within minutes, Washington's shells struck Kirishima repeatedly, tearing through her superstructure, riddling the deck, and igniting fires below. Damage control parties struggled to contain the infernos, but successive hits penetrated the armored citadel, causing catastrophic flooding. The Japanese battleship's speed faltered, and her once dominant presence turned into a desperate fight for survival. Attempts to return fire were largely ineffective. Washington, maintaining superior position and using radar guidance, continued to score precise hits, methodically dismantling Kirishima's offensive capability. The battle lasted less than an hour, but the consequences were monumental. Kirishima capsized and sank, leaving the Japanese fleet without a key capital ship and signaling the effective end of Japanese surface supremacy in the region. The duel of these iron giants demonstrated a profound shift in naval warfare. Where once night engagements had favored the Japanese, now technology, training, and tactical innovation allowed American forces to dominate. Washington's victory was not just a triumph of steel and firepower, it was a demonstration that the balance of power in the Pacific had begun to tilt irreversibly. For the men of Guadalcanal and the Navy alike, the battle was a bitter lesson. Traditional Japanese night fighting tactics, once nearly invincible, could now be countered, and the age of surface invincibility was ending. From that night forward, the American Navy would increasingly dictate the tempo and outcome of engagements across the Solomons and beyond. The waters surrounding Guadalcanal earned a grim nickname during the brutal campaign of 1942, Ironbottom Sound. It was not a poetic term, it was a literal description of the sea floor, littered with the twisted hulls of cruisers, destroyers, and countless smaller vessels from both Japanese and American navies. Every night of fighting added new casualties, and the once clear waters became a testament to the unforgiving nature of naval warfare in the Solomons. The strategic geography of the area compounded the challenge. Narrow channels, reefs, and shallow coves restricted maneuverability. Japanese forces relied on the Tokyo Express, a series of high-speed destroyer runs delivering troops, supplies, and artillery under the cover of night. The Americans, learning from repeated defeats, deployed radar-equipped cruisers and destroyers to intercept these runs, creating a deadly cat-and-mouse game where one miscalculation could mean the loss of an entire ship. The toll was staggering. Heavy cruisers such as USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, and HMAS Canberra had already been lost during the campaign, and numerous destroyers were crippled or sunk. On the Japanese side, veteran ships like Kirishima and Furutaka were destroyed, and the losses of experienced crews were irreplaceable. Each shipwreck not only represented material loss but also a loss of tactical knowledge, seamanship, and morale. Every night in Ironbottom Sound became a crucible. American and Japanese sailors engaged in chaotic close-quarters battles, with torpedoes streaking through pitch-black waters, gunfire lighting up clouds of smoke and spray, and ships maneuvering with deadly precision to avoid catastrophe. The ocean became both battlefield and graveyard, a place where the smallest error could mean instant death. Beyond the immediate tactical consequences, Ironbottom Sound symbolized the attritional nature of the Guadalcanal campaign. Japan could no longer replace its losses as quickly as the Americans, and every sunken ship further eroded the ability of the Imperial Navy to sustain operations. American forces, while suffering their own losses, gradually gained the advantage in training, coordination, and technology, particularly with radar-guided gunfire and improved night fighting tactics. By the end of 1942, the waters surrounding Guadalcanal were strewn with the remnants of both navies. Ironbottom Sound was no longer just a location, it had become a monument to sacrifice, strategy, and the high stakes of naval warfare. The battle for Guadalcanal would continue, but the psychological and material impact of these losses would resonate far beyond the Solomons, underscoring the brutal reality. In the Pacific, control of the sea meant life or death, and every night could be a final one. By late November 1942, the grueling naval battles around Guadalcanal had exacted an enormous toll on both sides. Japanese forces, despite tactical victories in night engagements, were facing a strategic collapse. Ships were lost faster than they could be replaced, experienced crews were dwindling, and the American hold on Henderson Field threatened to nullify Japan's ability to resupply or reinforce their positions on the island. The Japanese Imperial Navy faced an impossible choice: continue risking annihilation in a series of night actions or withdraw to preserve what remained of its fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's successors, recognizing the dire situation, ordered a final withdrawal of major naval forces, effectively conceding Guadalcanal to the Americans. The once feared Tokyo Express would continue in a limited fashion, but its ability to influence the battle had been fatally diminished. This final withdrawal marked the end of Japanese naval dominance in the Solomons. The battleship and cruiser fleets that had once terrorized American forces were now diminished shadows of their former strength. American radar-guided ships and aircraft had demonstrated that technological advantage, coordination, and persistent pressure could overcome even Japan's most skilled night-fighting tactics. For the men on Guadalcanal, the victory came at a tremendous cost. Countless ships had been sunk, thousands of sailors and marines had died, and the ocean surrounding the island, later named Ironbottom Sound, remained littered with the remnants of the ferocious struggle. Yet the psychological and strategic effect was decisive. Japan's withdrawal allowed the Americans to solidify their beachhead, ensure air superiority, and begin the long, costly process of removing Japanese forces from the island entirely. The broken spear symbolizes the failure of Japan's last desperate attempts to reclaim initiative. It was a testament to human courage and ingenuity, as well as the unforgiving nature of attritional warfare. Guadalcanal would remain a turning point in the Pacific, showing that even a determined and skilled adversary could be overcome when industrial capacity, technology, and tactical innovation aligned. The island, the waters, and the countless wrecks beneath the surface stand as a stark reminder: in the Pacific theater, control of the sea and air determined the fate of nations, and sometimes, the greatest victory comes not from overwhelming firepower, but from persistence, adaptation, and strategic endurance.